Viele Flüchtlinge, die in Europa ankommen, brauchen vor allem eins: Informationen. Informationen über Europa, die europäische Kultur oder ganz einfach über unseren Alltag und unsere Regeln. Diese Erfahrung hat jedenfalls der deutsche Magnum-Fotograf Thomas Dvorak gemacht, als er im vergangenen Jahr Flüchtlinge auf dem Weg nach Deutschland mit seiner Kamera begleitet hat. Und er wollte helfen. Er hat eine Idee daraus entwickelt, gemeinsam mit vielen anderen, die sich dann an diesem Projekt beteiligt haben. Rund 20 Journalisten waren es, Fotografen, Autoren, Flüchtlinge selbst haben mitgestaltet und über Monate hinweg ein Buch produziert. Europa, so der Titel, illustrierte Einführung für Migranten und Flüchtlinge. Heute wird dieses sehr ungewöhnliche Buch nun zum ersten Mal vorgestellt. Ab Mitte November ist es auch erhältlich. An dem Projekt haben sich beteiligt die Allianz Kulturstiftung und der AFAC finanziell. Wir freuen uns nun sehr, den Initiator und Fotografen Thomas Dvorak zu begrüßen und die Autorin, die für die Texte in diesem Buch verantwortlich ist, Aliyah Malek. Herzlich willkommen. Kommen Sie zu uns. So, wir haben hier einmal für Sie das Mikrofon. Sie haben ein Mikrofon. So let me talk English now. Aliyah Malek just flew in from New York. Let me introduce you quickly. Aliyah is a civil rights lawyer and a highly reputed journalist who had lived and worked in the US, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Syria and in Italy. She was born in Baltimore, US, to Syrian immigrant parents. Today she's an expert in Middle East topics. And she's also a political book writer. Until December last year, she has been senior staff writer at Al Jazeera America. And what you see here on the screen, these are already pictures from the book. This is the PDF running through. This is the whole book you can see now on screen, page after page, just to give you an imagination, an impression of how this book looks like. Thomas Dvorak is a well-known photographer with the agency Magnum, known for world best photographs, as you know. He is born in German Bavaria. He later began his career as a freelance photographer in East Europe. He lived in Georgia for several years. The Caucasus and Chechnya became his main working fields. He also lived in Afghanistan and Iraq. And last year he returned to Europe and covered stories of the refugees. Thomas, so how did you get the idea for this book?
When you already said it, it came out of, I'm a documentary photographer, so it was sort of the logical thing to cover the refugee crisis last year. I've always come across refugees in my work in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union, and so I just did what I always do in a way, and I went to cover it mostly on the Balkans. But sooner, partly was frustration that I thought, well, we're all doing the same, there's so many photographers, suddenly there's this big interest in it. But mostly, I think what made a huge difference was that the main problems the refugees had were questions. They kept asking me questions. They kept asking me about what is life like, what is the difference between Sweden and Belgium, a lot of things. I mean, I have a certain idea, but I'm definitely not a specialist in explaining the difference between all this, and so I had the very simple and crude idea to create. I wanted to make a guidebook. I was like, look, why don't we all get together? There's 10 of us, like photographers from my agency alone, who are all working on the migrant crisis. We are maybe not the most destined people to create a guidebook, but we're all there. We have the first-hand information. We have this. Why don't we turn it around?
But this is not only a guidebook now.
No. So what was the change? What it came out afterwards was that. Actually, it would have been a little bit sort of a vanity project to do a guidebook because the refugees already have information. They have information from NGOs, from websites, from Facebook pages they exchange, and I'm sure Alia can say more about that even because, so there was no need anymore. So that because of that experience, it became, also because it took much more time than, well, it didn't happen within a couple of weeks, so the main movement of refugees had slowed down a little bit, so it became more urgent that we thought, well, let's do an introduction to Europe, which was born more out of our collaboration. We started with the writers, with the journalists who were on the project.
So, Aliyah, so what is now the purpose of this book? Whom are you aiming for? What is it looking like?
Is this on? Well, what I was asked to do was to create and develop the content that would introduce Europe to the newcomers, whether they were refugees or migrants who were coming to Europe, and to do it in 4 languages and in 1 book. So I don't know if you guys have had an opportunity to see, but this book works one way, in English and French, and in this way in Arabic and Farsi. And the idea was to be able to reach as many of the different language groups of the people that were coming over, as well as to make it accessible to Europeans themselves who might be interested in these topics and who no longer speak Arabic or Farsi or never spoke Arabic or Farsi. So these were the 4 languages. And the question I was, the principal question was how to introduce Europe, or what story of Europe to tell to the people who are arriving now. And if I were to ask any of you, tell me what Europe is, I'm sure there would be many different responses or many different stories to tell. And what I kept coming back to was I also covered the refugee trail. I followed a group of Syrians from Turkey all the way to Germany. And several points there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of moving, and there were a lot of conversations that I had primarily with Syrians and Iraqis because I was working in Arabic. And I was struck by these conversations because they often were discussions of, or this is what people would say to me, and I had had these conversations in Syria. I spent the first 2 years of the Syrian uprising inside Syria. And I frequently heard that what is happening in Syria is so utterly unique, that the history of humanity has never witnessed anything like this in terms of the devastation, in terms of the loss, in terms of the disintegration of a multi-layered society, that this idea that all of a sudden you are living in society one day and in the next day that you are involved in this incredible civil uprising and then civil war that you don't know where it came from. And I had heard this a lot, but ironically, we were having these conversations as we were coming from Turkey to Greece, where so many, as the previous speaker explained, so many refugees, so many Greeks had left Turkey just not even 100 years before. And during the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, we had this conversation on the border of Serbia and Croatia, where we had to navigate still active mines. So we were walking through the former Yugoslavia, and yet somehow there's this disconnect. And then everybody's trying to reach Germany, because Germany is this place of stability and opportunity. It's also the gateway to the European Union. And yet, maybe it's somewhere in the consciousness that's not readily accessible when you're making this arduous journey. But, Germany is a place that only 70 years ago was completely destroyed, where a wall ran through it and broken up Germany in a way that Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan might see themselves broken up. And it's the gateway to a European Union that existed and was created to avoid and to preempt this return to this path of war, which is what had sort of driven European history. And it was like, well, maybe there's something here that is quite relevant, because in terms of being informative, we want it to be informative, we want it to be engaging and interesting, and we want it to be dignified. I think a lot of the things that have been produced for refugees since they've arrived here have, sort of been, a little bit, not assuming a very low level of culture and intelligence on behalf of the people making the journey. So we decided to introduce Europe to these new arrivals through the story of conflict and migration, in part because these conflicts that I spoke about have also set off waves of migration, many of which was German migration from the former Soviet Union and ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. And these two things have very much shaped the Europe that we find ourselves in today. And this was a way to make, we thought, the story relatable. And at the same time, because of the political currents in Germany right now and in Europe as a whole, in the separate nation states and in Europe as a whole, of Euroscepticism and this right-wing growth, and we were approaching the Brexit at the time, the referendum on the Brexit, there was this need to sort of re-engage European audiences with this history and to remind them of that history, especially as people sort of speak about this idea of Europe like it just emerged perfect from the sea, and this sort of history was forgotten. So because the book is in 4 languages, it's also an opportunity for dialogue that sometimes doesn't happen so easily between the different communities within Europe as a whole. And so these were the ideas, these were the tasks that was before me, and the 2 lenses that we finally chose to sort of take this gigantic story and make it more accessible and more relevant, with the idea that, because a lot of the folks, as they're making this trip, you know, they think they're coming to somewhere super unfamiliar. There's a lot of shame around the idea that like you let your country somehow disintegrate and you're not even sure how it happened. And even though every conflict has its specificity, we thought that if there's something relatable that both audiences or all the audiences might be able to see or recognize a little bit of themselves in the other, and that in that there might be a way to find a kind of point of commonality in dialogue and a kind of way to find sure footing in a new place, and at the same time to maybe find some hope and some prescriptions, or you know, to just sort of, these are how other conflicts have resolved themselves and how there's been a post-conflict, because no matter what, regimes fall, governments change, people do get sick of killing each other, and in some sense there's always a post, and it might be interesting, we thought, if there was a way to sort of tell that story of Europe to this particular audience.
Okay, so this is the idea of the book. Let's talk a little bit about how is it done. What you find is in the back of the book you have a practical guide. We could see this on the screen, where you're giving, Thomas, you're giving just, you know, general informations about life in Germany, right?
I can talk more about the photographic side of it, because I think additionally to the 4 languages, well, of course, look, I'm a photographer, I'm not writing anything. I'm like, yeah, I do, but it's like, has no particular value, and most other photographers don't. So we definitely come from a visual side. So there was a photography-driven, well, the archive of my agency was the backbone of how we're going to build these stories around it. So luckily we found enough.
So these are basically photos from Magnum?
This is all pictures from Magnum. There's my part in it, which I really don't want to enhance in any way. I mean, this is not for me to excel or whatever in photography here, but it was really like I would fill the gaps of photography it's a very difficult situation. I think we're all used to cater to our audience. We're all used to cater to the European, American, Western audience. I go to some screwed up place, I'll take pictures, I'll send it to a magazine. That's it. So this was really, the exercise was really to try to turn it around. To really turn around to create something that is for the public, that has an information value, which maybe in Europe people don't need. Or people don't, they already know this, they already know about whatever, garbage separation, about pork versus halal, this kind of very simple, practical things. And this reflected on the text. I think this is what you guys were talking to, you were talking to migrants. I talked to everybody I could get a hold of. What would you like to see? Like, you're an Afghan, I mean, I'm closer to the Afghan, Iranian, whatever that group, I can talk to them better. But it's like, when you came to Europe, what was your question? What was your information? What were your surprises? What were your issues? What would you want to know more about? So really to try, in a very clumsy way, we did it. I don't have any scientific data of what refugees really want to hear.
Yeah.
And it still hasn't passed the test, so I don't know. I hope they're not going to throw it back into our faces and say we got it totally wrong. But so that's how we built it, and from the initial idea. So there are all these different chapters, like you know how you created the chapters, and then.
And Alia, you talked to a lot of refugees as well, and some of those very personal stories you can find in the book as well. And you told me that eventually you would like to read some of those stories for us.
We could. I mean, I should just say, tell you the contents, essentially. So it works in reverse. So if you were reading from an Arabic to Farsi, you would start in chapter 1, which is called Rising from the Ashes of War, from Bitter Enemies to European Union. And we sort of tell that history. And then the next one is the nuts and bolts, how the EU actually works. And the readers, then now the 4 languages meet in the middle at the practical information. And then for the Arabic and Farsi audience, it's what makes Europe Europe. And this was sort of the way we talked about what daily life here looks like. You know, we've confronted a lot of the taboos that exist between the sorts of places that have become the flashpoints, and the differences between the cultures, again, in quotations, from where the refugees come from versus the cultures here. So sexual freedoms, for example. And then the last chapter is about the actual coming to Europe. But throughout all of this, what we've done, because as Thomas talked about, there's something about journalism. I mean, it's more visible in photography, it's less visible in journalism, but it happens just as much in journalism, where we are subjecting subjecting, usually people who are going through mass trauma and mass tragedy, and sort of subjecting them to the gaze of the outsider, because we're relating this story, to audiences that we presume are different from the people who are living these experiences. So one of the ways we pushed back on that was to have the oral histories included in here. So oral history, I don't know if, is there a tradition in German of oral histories? And it's a very American thing.
It's an American thing, but let's just listen, because
Sure.
I think it would be interesting to get a feeling for this book and for the stories.
In Germany? Okay, I don't work in German. But this is a story from a woman who moved to Germany. And I'll just read it for you, and you can hear where she's from. She now lives in Friedland, and her name is Ira.
Yeah.
So my husband Victor and I met in Sunday school at the evangelical church in a suburb of the city of Sigulda, Latvia, a part of the Soviet Union, in 1973. He was my teacher back then. Our classes were secret. The USSR had banned religion and persecuted German Protestants like us. The rationale went like this: Hitler was German and we were German, so we must be collaborators with his regime. This made life in Latvia pretty difficult. One morning after Easter, my grade school teacher singled me out in class for having attended church with my family. She used to be a partisan against the Germans during World War II and didn't like German children. She was mean, and things got very ugly that day. She asked me, "Is this true that you went to church? Who went with you?" It felt like a cross-examination. I told her the truth. In front of the entire class, she made me say, "I will never go to church again. I will never believe in this God again." Victor, who immigrated to Germany before I did, wrote letters to our Sunday class at the evangelical church. We weren't in love back then, but his words supported me. I knew that West Germany was different. I knew there was freedom. Fewer and fewer Germans stayed behind, and we wanted to be a part of our community again, too. We moved to West Germany when I was 14, in October 1977. I remember the night I arrived in the transit camp at Friedland. I was standing on the train tracks leading to the camp. Geraniums blossomed. Nurses brought coffee and hot chocolate. My mother cried when she heard the church bells ring. She was very religious, and she had never heard them in her life. After the warm welcome, things changed. I was German, but also different, the way I dressed, my hair, my accent. Back in Latvia, girls were still wearing miniskirts, while German fashion had moved on. Knee-length skirts were all the rage here. Luckily, my mother had bought me a red checkered shirt that was just right and a blue jacket in Riga on our way to Friedland. The outfit looked beautiful. I wore it to school every day. But because it was the only set of clothes I owned that I liked, girls started bullying me, saying I didn't wash myself, that I was dirty. My dad didn't allow me to cut my hair, so I wore it in 2 thick braids, not cool at all. One day, some girls at school put my hands behind my back while they untied my hair and smeared makeup on my face. They wanted to snap a picture of me and said they would submit it to Bravo, a popular youth magazine. "Now you're like us," they said, laughing. But of course I wasn't. I learned to speak German at home and from Bibles that Victor had given me. At school, my teachers put me in the lowest grade, thinking I wasn't smart. My grammar just wasn't the same as theirs. Because I immigrated from the Soviet Union, they put me there. It was up to me to find my way out. I worked very hard to improve my language skills until only my appearance hinted at my background. I graduated as a certified nurse in 1984, top of my class, and a few years later I studied landscape architecture. One day at work, I read a newspaper article about the Friedland camp. It had just opened a museum. It is still the main point of entry for ethnic Germans and others migrating here since World War II. I quit my job and started working here as a guide in April 2016. During tours, I tell newcomers, it's not going to be easy. Had I maybe assimilated more quickly, had I cut my hair against the will of my father or bought other clothes, things could have been easier. But I felt at the time I could not give up on who I was, not in the USSR where my faith was forbidden, not here. So look for advice from people you trust, just as I sought support from Victor. We married, and now he's a minister and marriage counselor in Germany. I hope my experiences can mean something for refugees. So the idea was that even when somebody is ethnically German, differences, things that we take for granted that must be our innate differences are actually things that can be constructed. We can find difference sort of anywhere if we're looking for it. And it was, I would hope that both audiences would find something in that sort of maybe demystifies what is happening in Europe at this moment.
After having talked to so many people so many refugees, Thomas and Alia. What is in your eye the key for integration, for good integration of refugees in Germany? I mean, it's a big question, but did you find simple answers while joining those people coming to Europe?
I think it's presumptuous to have a big answer on it. And I think that's also what I wasn't trying. I don't have an answer to this, and we don't have anything. And I think this is, if anything, can be a little slice. I think information is good. It's good to.
Yeah.
It's good to give them give them perspective.
Okay.
That's it. There's a gazillion other things that have to be done, which somebody else needs to coordinate.
And this book might be a bridge eventually, showing that there are similar experiences in the past, right?
That's what was my the wish, to make it as something, like you said, it's going to be available. It's actually not going to be available. The book is not going to be. It's not going to be for sale. It's not going to be.
It's for free. It's absolutely for free.
Thanks to the organizations and everything. It's going to be distributed.
Okay, please explain us, where do people get those books actually? So what do you do now? So
from now, also during the research for the book, we've been in, like Jessica Murray, who is here, who has held it all together gloriously. We've been in touch with a lot of different organizations, NGOs who work with refugees, and already they knew, in order to give the information. So we were in touch with them to know what they do, to be able to inform about their work. At the same time, we established a contact that once the book was going to be ready, they will receive books for free, which they then can distribute among their refugees and migrants. So that's the way it's going to be. The book is going to be distributed mostly in the 10 key countries in Europe, through organizations to refugees who can read it. On the ground, how they're going to handle it. Of course, there's not enough books for every refugee, but they're going to be accessible. So, and on top of it, there is going to be a free PDF, an online version of the entire book, which we're still fine-tuning on it, but it's going to be for download everywhere and hosted in as many sites as possible. I mean, it's up for grabs. The book is basically.
Okay, so
anybody who wants to host it can.
Right. If you are interested, if you want to have a look into this book, you can look up the homepage of AFAC. They will put the PDF tonight in the internet, and you can watch it. But there are many more organizations, lots of NGOs.
More the better. I don't know exactly how many now, but it's a continuous process.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much for giving us this presentation of the book, and thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you. That was really impressive. Thank you.
Thank you. How come you don't have...
Ja, also was lernen wir draus? Migration braucht bürgerschaftliches Engagement wie dieses, und je kreativer, desto besser, ganz offensichtlich. Damit geht die heutige Veranstaltung zu Ende, meine Damen und Herren. Schön, dass Sie dabei waren. Zum Abschluss jetzt noch mal ein schönes Stückchen Musik des Damaskus String Quintetts. Morgen geht es dann ab 18 Uhr weiter mit Teil 2 dieser Veranstaltung. Ich darf mich von Ihnen schon mal verabschieden. Hier wird schon alles vorbereitet für die Musik. Ich darf mich schon verabschieden, darf Sie aber im Namen der Veranstalter natürlich noch mal einladen zum Empfang. Da oben werden wir gleich miteinander anstoßen und ein bisschen plaudern können. Und ich habe keine weiteren Hinweise. Gibt es noch Hinweise, wichtige? Nein, ich habe nichts vergessen. Gut. Also 2 Stücke Musik, glaube ich, hören wir jetzt noch vom Damaskus String Quintett. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass die Musiker, die übrigens in Bremen und in Berlin zurzeit leben, hier für uns heute spielen werden. Ich hoffe, da kommen Sie auch gleich auf die Bühne und werden uns noch mal ein kleines, schönes Abschlusskonzert geben.